Hello everybody, and welcome to this last panel of the day. So in this panel, we're going to be discussing about how to strike a balance between protecting our rights to privacy in our private communications and the need to protect children online who are victims of child sexual abuse. Now, for some, it's a delicate balance. For some, it's not a delicate balance, and the decision's been taken. So since August of this year, we've got in place in Europe a regulation which allows so-called providers of number-independent interpersonal communication services, and these are basically WhatsApp-type services, to detect and to remove online child sexual abuse from their services. So basically, that means that they're allowed to scan the pictures and the videos and the text messages that we send each other, but not our voice communications, and to report any child sexual abuse material that they may find to law enforcement authorities and to other interested organizations. So in this panel, and with my distinguished speakers, we're going to be discussing why this regulation became necessary, and if in the regulation the balance is right or not. And also, since it's a temporary derogation, we know that something else is coming, and we'll be talking about the Commission's next steps and if anything should be improved in this next wave of regulation. So without further delay, just let me introduce you to my fellow panelists. So I'm really pleased because we've really got different interests here represented in the panel. We've got representatives from EDRI, which defend the digital rights and in particular privacy. We've got InHope, which combats online child sexual abuse, and we've got Microsoft, which is behind some of this technology that's being used to detect child sexual abuse and is using that technology itself. I must say that we heard yesterday that unfortunately Catherine Bolst from the European Commission can't be with us. So that's obviously that's a shame, but we'll try and do what we can without her. So again, just before we start, I thought I'd just give you a very quick overview of what this temporary regulation is about. So it's a temporary derogation to two specific articles in the ePrivacy Directive, Article 5 and 6. And these articles, in fact, protect the confidentiality of our private communications and of the traffic data that's generated. And this derogation was needed because, in fact, of another reform of the telecom sector, whereby these number-independent interpersonal communication services became caught by these articles and were basically, therefore, bound to protect the confidentiality of communications, just like any other telecom operator. So before this reform, they were already using, some of these webmail messaging services were already using this special technology to detect and remove online child sexual abuse. But since then, without this new regulation, basically they would have not been allowed to do that anymore. So now they're allowed to do it, and the framework's in place, and there are special rules in this regulation that we're going to be discussing with my fellow panelists. So without further delay, maybe let me start with Denton Howard, who is the executive director of InHope, and he's going to explain to us what he thinks of this regulation has brought, if it's necessary, if it's indispensable, and basically, yeah, your views on it. Denton, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much, Michelle. You've sort of set a high bar in that introduction. So I think what we'll start with is a bit of a thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Forum Europe for inviting me here to speak with you all today on a series of topics around the whole ePrivacy derogation, which, while many may not even realize it, will affect everyone in many ways, although most people won't even know it's affected them. So firstly, about who am I? Well, my name is Denton Howard, as you can see on screen and everything. My role is Executive Director of InHope, which, if you haven't heard of it, is the International Association of Internet Hotlines. We're a collective organization or association, currently of 46 hotlines, and soon to be, as in from the 15th of this month, we'll have 50 hotlines operating in 45 countries. And now, for those unsure about what hotlines do, because we have a hotline in each of those countries, they allow or offer the public a way to anonymously, and that is a very important aspect, to anonymously report online material that they think is child sexual abuse material. Now, a hotline, when they receive a report, they then assess that report, and we use the term a URL, and then they assess it, and they're experts in this area. They're well trained by law enforcement, by ourselves, and in many cases by industry partners. If it's illegal, they will take action, and then that action will be reporting to law enforcement, contacting industry partners, and then basically getting the content removed as rapidly as possible. There are also consequent actions. So, for example, if the content is hosted in another country, and let me tell you, it nearly always is hosted somewhere else, then that report is shared via the InHope infrastructure known as ICCAM. That report, it's an instant system, and that gets shared with the relevant hotline in the hosting country. Now, that allows for rapid action to be taken to get that content removed. Also, data gets shared with the relevant national law enforcement agencies. And importantly, new identified content gets shared with Interpol to assist them in the development of verified hash lists and victim identification. So I could talk in a lot of detail on this subject and on InHub for a very long time, but that would take away from the subject of why we're here today to talk about. So on regard to InHub, if you weren't familiar with it, I would like you to take away 2 points from my brief introduction, which is one, that you understand what a hotline is and why it's there, and two, the absolute importance of rapid removal of content once it's been identified. And I'm going to mention the word rapid many, many times in the course of today because that is a key feature. And if you want more information, please reach out to me. I'm probably the easiest person in the world to find, or go to inhope.org. So that little introduction aside, I just want to do a quick run through to the point that Michelle asked me to talk about, which is in regard to the core issue. And also the future legislation and the implications around combating CSAM. So in regard to the ePrivacy derogation in practice, in towards to my day-to-day job and my networks, it didn't have that much direct impact. But it has had a severe impact, or the absence of it initially had a severe impact on the ability of many technology companies to do what I say is the right thing, to actually go out and try and stop their services from being abused and trying to detect previously known or previously seen identified CSAM and get it removed, and then also to gather information about who is sharing that information via their platform so that those people can be, to use the term, brought to justice and hopefully maybe a victim actually rescued. So in combating CSAM, there is no silver bullet. There's no one cure. There's no one thing that anybody or any organization can do yet, unless somebody comes up with a really cool idea. But there are many weapons which collectively we can all use to make an impact. So I've tried to narrow this down. So first of all, hotlines. I'm obviously biased. So hotlines allow content that has been identified as new or previously unseen, and thus wouldn't be on any hash list. Um, that basically means that there is a new victim. So hotlines then can take steps to get that content removed, which I mentioned before, flagged to the correct authorities. And then also that allows information to be percolated up so that they can populate into hash lists and allow for the automated detection and removal of content from services. There's another aspect which is within the derogation is that upload filtering, because we always talk about automated detection, and everybody thinks that it's people who have stored files, but there are also communications providers, and Michelle mentioned it in her introduction. They also have the ability, whether they choose to do it or not, is upload filtering, where they can use hash filters to basically check content. It doesn't mean that they're reviewing content or taking copies of people content. It's just comparing a hash without actually viewing the actual content itself. And they can stop that content, if it's known CSAM, from being uploaded in the first place, harvest the reporting information, who's uploading it, from what account. So to get to my end point is, whatever the future holds in terms of legislation, all of those kind of activities, be it hotlines, industries doing automated detection, and upload filtering, they need to be permitted within whatever legislation comes down the track. Now, again, I could talk for ages about this, and that's not the point of the initial discussions, but I want to leave this element of introduction with one thing, and it's on privacy rights. Obviously, I like my privacy, you like your privacy, but I want everybody to know that we all focus on the rights of the possessor of the media. Okay, whether it's pictures of your family, your wife, your pictures of your dog, that's fine. But we're talking about child sexual abuse material. There is no legal reason that anybody, anywhere, should possess a copy of known child sexual abuse material. And we also seem to focus on the rights of people's privacy to possess whatever they want to possess. But people forget that a child sexual abuse material victim also has privacy rights. So we have to get into a situation of we all want privacy, but whose privacy is more important? Now, on that point, I'm going to finish. Hopefully, I've posed a question to you at the start of today, and I'm going to hand back to Michelle.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much for that clear introduction, Denton. I think that's very interesting. What I propose we do is that you can all the audience, everybody can think about questions, and of course I'll take questions. But I thought I'd let my panelists have a first round, and they can each provide their statement, and then we'll take the questions. So you can start sending questions through the chat if you'd like to. So I think what I would like is to have Catherine Garcia van Hoogstraten, thank you, who is a director at Microsoft, and she's the director of responsible technology. So she's, I think, the right person to talk to us about, what technologies are being developed by Microsoft, what technology is being used by Microsoft, and how this regulation has enabled you to do what you should do in relation to the detection, removal, and notification of child sexual abuse. So, Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle, and definitely very much thrilled to be here sharing this panel with my co-panelists, and that you're chairing this amazing discussion, which is very critical. And one thing that we would like to make clear is that through this presentation is a bit of our Microsoft approach on safety by design, and of course, taking a stock on not only the ePrivacy regulation, but also the upcoming long-term CSAM regulation. On safety by design, I would like to share, and this is kind of to explain the development and where we stand. All in all, online child safety has been a company priority at Microsoft for more than 2 decades. We have seen, a global risk landscape evolve over the last 20 years, and our proactive, protective, and preventive measures have evolved with that landscape. So in that manner, we approach safety by design in a multiple layer way. So we include through our policies, through our processes, our procedures, and through empowering our users, our children, our youth. And therefore, this is a multi-layer approach. We devise and implement these policies, going beyond self-governed product developments and operations, which includes, of course, a code of conduct that we have in place for our users of our services, as well as the content reporting options that we provide to users. We also continue to understand best practices, such as the one, for instance, shared by our colleague of InHope, including through our membership of the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership. Next to that, as already known, we create tools, features, and functionality in our products and services, having considered safety for our users from the outset of the product development, and with the user empowerment as a core priority. So some examples that I could share, of course, is the most known tool, PhotoDNA, that is used by many leading tech companies and law enforcement to scan for child sexual exploitation and abuse imagery. But also, we provide tools to empower families. For instance, the Xbox family setting apps. Recently, we have launched a child-friendly browser with age kids mode, so parent can choose an appropriate experience based on their child's age. And finally, next to that, we are there are also very complex whole society issues when we discuss about CSAM. So a multi-stakeholder collaboration is a core pillar of our safety by design approach. And addressing child sexual abuse, exploitation online. For this matter, we have a long-standing member with We Protect Global Alliance, as well as with the Tech Coalition. And so therefore, there is a strong commitment on that side. And I think that's how we stand. All in all, to summarize these points, there are three high-level principles that we have been using to address the increasing value tension between digital safety and privacy protection. First of all, we are, as I already mentioned, preventing child sexual abuse material while protecting privacy. So for us, proportionality, necessity, and balancing of fundamental rights plays an important role in the development and deployment of our technologies. Next to that, we also consider that there is a need for service providers that work to detect and remove illegal content that currently face patchwork of rules. So therefore, we consider that there is a need for avoiding conflict of law. And for instance, some of these issues have come across during the legislation, during the negotiations of the DSA, the Digital Services Act, and of course, during the ePrivacy regulation. So if we take into account the National Center for Missing Children, the NEMEC, cyber pipeline reports, these were plummeted to 46% by 25th of December of 2020 as consequence of these laws. These numbers demonstrate the significance of risk related to a rising legal complexity. So in the future, the lack of clarity on the rules that apply to ancillary communications features may exacerbate this effect. Therefore, it will be unfortunate if this uncertainty prevents services from providing, for example, parental control tools on our Xbox live chats with families. And so therefore, we stand quite clear on avoiding these conflicts of law. And finally, ensuring equity and transparency and accountability. So for us, these three mechanisms must ensure the proportionality and subsidiarity of content moderation measures to avoid the use of overly privacy intrusive tools.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Catherine, for those remarks. So it sounds to me as if you're quite satisfied with the regulation as it stands. In a sense, it provides it's a regulation, so at least we all have the same rules in Europe to follow. So I suppose that it does avoid conflicts of law that you stressed, but only in relation, I suppose, to number independent intercommunication services. So maybe now, if we turn to the last speaker of the panel, so that's Ela Jakubowska, who's a policy advisor at EDRI, and I see in her bio that she's also one of Political's top 28 in the European tech space, due to her work to mobilize civil society around justice and anti-discrimination. So I'm sure, Ella, welcome. I'm sure you've got lots of things to say about this regulation, and perhaps more on the privacy side than on although I'm sure you also, of course, agree about the rights of children, of course. But please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to be here today to talk about this super important issue. And I'd actually like to start with a quote from Alexander Hanff, who some of you might be familiar with. He's a privacy expert and himself is a survivor of abuse as a child. And when the Commission's proposal for an ePrivacy derogation came out last year, Alexander strongly criticised the proposal. And what he said was, "I don't want children to be abused. I could never wish the life I've had to lead on anyone, let alone a child. But I also do not want those same children to grow up in a police or surveillance state where their ability to speak without fear vanishes because they have no privacy or ability to communicate in confidence." And I think that's the crux of the question we're tackling here. It's not whether or not we should be acting to tackle child abuse and exploitation, because of course we should be. But it's rather about whether measures that can lead to mass surveillance are a proportionate or democratic response. So the first thing I want to explore a bit is kind of debunking this idea that somehow it's children's rights versus privacy. As Denton and Catherine both said already, this is a really complex issue. But really often we hear that it's a simple, obvious choice between children's rights and safety on the one hand and everybody else's privacy on the other. We've even heard surveys saying that many people say they would give up their privacy to keep children safe. And that's really a total misrepresentation of the issue that's at stake here. And such an approach is trying to boil down this incredibly complex social and criminal issue to a quick technological fix. And furthermore, this victims versus privacy framing also runs the risk of ignoring the fact that some of the proposed measures for detecting CSAM that we come across, in fact, can invade young people's privacy in a really, really damaging way. And going even further, what often gets forgotten as well in this debate is that when we're discussing the ePrivacy derogation that was passed earlier this year, what we're discussing is a derogation from a piece of democratically passed legislation protecting the fundamental right to privacy. And unlike the temporary derogation, that original ePrivacy directive was shown to be necessary, proportionate, and legal. So any deviation from it needs to be as limited and controlled as possible so as not to undermine the original fundamental rights protecting ePrivacy directive. So I think there's some really important lessons that we can bring in from the process so far. As I've just alluded, there were some parts of that process that were deeply alarming for us. And when I say us, just to kind of add in, I represent EDRI, as Michelle said. EDRI stands for European Digital Rights, which is a network of 45 human rights organizations from across Europe, as well as dozens of academics and other experts representing the rights to privacy and data protection, as well as all of the interconnected rights such as equality and non-discrimination, free expression and association, and really the full suite of fundamental rights. And so the first point I want to draw out from what we learned from this process so far is the problem caused by the systematic procedural failings. Several members of the European Parliament that were involved in getting this ePrivacy derogation passed said that the pressure they were put under to approve the proposal amounted to moral blackmail. And there was an MEP, Sophia in 't Veld from the Renew group, who said that whenever she asked a critical question about the derogation, which, as we all know, is her job as a co-legislator, she was accused of not being committed to tackling child sexual abuse. And that led to a situation where ultimately, when the derogation was passed, she told Commissioner Johansson that we both know that the result on the table is legally flawed. And that was supported by other MEPs as well, saying that a proposal for untargeted scanning would not hold up before national or EU courts. And then the second issue with the temporary legislation was summed up by the European Data Protection Supervisor. Speaking about the Commission's initial proposal, he called it excessive. He pointed out that it had no clear legal basis, And he also pointed out that the Commission did not provide any evidence that it was a proportionate response that was being proposed, which is something that is required of all EU laws. And then third, although the Parliament were able to introduce a number of safeguards that we very much supported, such as requiring the least privacy invasive technologies, creating reporting obligations, and having national data protection authorities and the European Data Protection Board as oversight bodies, there were still a lot of things that were really lacking. The most significant one being that the derogation passed earlier this year allowed the scanning of all communication all the time, the complete opposite of targeted and potentially amounting to mass surveillance. And whilst there was also another positive that audio communications were taken out of scope thanks to the Parliament, very invasive text-based analysis scanning remained in scope in the proposal. And I know we'll come later to some other things that we're hearing about the future proposal and how else we can put these learnings into practice for the long-term proposal. So my final point then before I wrap up is also just to point to the fact that there's a lot of important evidence missing from the debate that we often hear about CSAM and the ePrivacy derogation. The first is actually the number of risks that are associated to many of the proposed CSAM detection methods that are allowed under the derogation and that we fear will be brought in under the long-term legislation too. For example, client-side scanning. There's even a DG Connect funded project on client-side scanning right now. And some of you may have seen a paper that came out in October from 14 of the world's foremost cybersecurity experts called Bugs in Our Pockets, where they explain that there isn't a safe way to do client-side scanning. In theory, it might sound like it's a great solution, but it actually makes every person's device, our mobile phones, vulnerable to the very criminal networks that these CSAM measures are aiming to deter. And when it makes our devices vulnerable, that includes young people's devices. Then there's a whole load of information that I think often gets missed out about the importance of the right to privacy for young people. It's not just talking about adults' privacy or everyone else's privacy against keeping children safe. It's actually the fact that children and young people really need their privacy as well. And that's why earlier this year, the UN released General Comment 25 on children's rights in the digital environment, which specifically opposes the routine and indiscriminate automated processing of young people's personal data because of how it impacts on their privacy, their free expression, and other rights. And there's another related issue of taking away safe spaces for survivors. If we go back to Alexander Hampf that I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, he has said that an ePrivacy derogation will inhibit support groups from being able to help abuse victims and runs the risk of driving abuse further underground. Mm-hmm. He also points to how the issue has been really instrumentalized by politicians. And he says that the ones that benefit from these measures at the end of the day are not children, but in fact are the big tech companies that make a profit from having their technology be used to undertake this constant scanning. So lastly, when I'm talking about evidence, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, going back again to the question of proportionality, the Commission hasn't even shared figures about actual prosecutions or convictions that have come from the amount of CSAM that's been detected. We always hear the amount of detection, but not actually about prosecutions and convictions. So that means that we're not able to scrutinize whether these measures are effective. As civil society, we have no access to those figures. And actually, evidence to the contrary came out today. There's been a really worrying investigation by some German journalists published this morning, showing that thousands of gigabytes of CSAM, equivalent to about a year of video footage that was reported to German police many years ago, was never removed and is still circulating because the police said they didn't have the human resources to follow through with the removal requests. Mm-hmm. So the EU has pushed through this temporary derogation for untargeted automated scanning. There's a long-term proposal coming that we fear could take even more privacy infringing measures. despite the fact that certain police forces aren't fulfilling basic duties on the information that they already have. They're failing exactly the kind of rapid response that Denton just explained is so important. So in conclusion, from everything I've just shared, I think we need to look at how there's been a huge democratic deficit in the process to pass the temporary proposal. We need to look at the fact that we don't have a European Data Protection Board or Fundamental Rights Agency opinion, and we have an ongoing and really serious lack of legal basis and evidence of proportionality. And so it would be a serious disregard for EU fundamental rights if we put forward a long-term proposal, even with the same measures as the short-term one, let alone measures that are more invasive. And so what I would love to see instead would be the Commission asking, how can we safeguard children without enabling the systematic surveillance of all our social media messages, dating chats, family conversations, and emails? And how can we work together to find ways to tackle crime without ushering in mass surveillance?
Mm-hmm. Thank you enormously, Ella, for your very clear presentation as well. I think we've got a lot of food for thought here. I'm very pleased to say, maybe if all the panelists can come up, that's nice. Thank you. We've got a few questions from the audience that I think we could perhaps tackle first. I think one question has already, in a way, been answered by you, Ella, during your, it came in through while you were speaking, actually. It's a question from, just a minute, sorry, yes, here we are, from MEP Patrick Breyer, who's saying that has anybody asked victims or children whether they actually want their private communications permanently scanned, and would they not prefer that would not happen? I think you've answered that, and with your maybe, but you talked about Alexander Hampf and the fact that he was a victim of child sexual abuse, and that he actually said that there were other ways of we don't want to go to a surveillance society, and therefore but maybe you want to comment again on that. But he's the MEP Patrick Breyer is quoting a YouGov survey. Or Denton, I don't know if either of you want to, or anybody who would like to reply to that.
If I could just jump in, I'm very careful about what I say here, because I have met quite a number of people who have been victims of child sexual abuse material. Okay, so and universally, they don't want their content out there, and they don't want it distributed. So that's the first point. So there's no and to that. That's a single sentence, and it's a single sentence on purpose. The second point I would say is, they never gave permission for that content to be recorded. They didn't, obviously they were raped and abused, but they certainly didn't give separate permission for that content to be shared. So they have privacy rights. It's their personal imagery. So if you want to be simplistic and legal about it, they are the image holder. They're the image center. The third point is, when they talk about asking, and I don't know who asked the question, but when they talk about the permission for the information to be shared, I would direct anybody to look. If they look up Phoenix 11, it was done by the Canadian Centre for the Protection of Children and another organization in the US, which just escapes me. I can't remember the name of the organization. There are anonymized videos of those victims and about what their views are. And I recommend in that point, anybody to watch that video, okay? And you make your own decisions about that. I have very clear opinions. A child who is under 18 cannot give consent, okay, from a legal perspective. So I say this as a parent, and I say this maybe from and again, I'm not a lawyer, but in the context of, they didn't give permission, they couldn't give permission. If it's illegal, and I'm going to say, if CSAM is, and I'm talking about just CSAM, I am not talking about sharing of personal images or any of that. That's a different communication, and all the points Ella made earlier. But I'm just talking about the sharing of recorded and identified, verified child sexual abuse material. There is no excuse, no reason for anybody to be exchanging that. I'm sorry if that's too black and white, but that's where I stand.
Okay, Ella?
Yeah, if I may come in on that, I would agree that it's not legitimate for anyone to be sharing that kind of content. But I think that's where it's really important to look at what's been passed in the EU, and furthermore what's going to be potentially in scope for the long-term legislation, because the ePrivacy derogation right now doesn't actually limit what is being searched for to those very specific examples. What Denton was saying earlier about only detecting known content, that's a potential safeguard. Whereas in fact, the ePrivacy derogation is allowing the very broad scanning of everyone's content, and that is not targeted, that is not proportionate. That is taking as a basis as if every person were a potential were suspected of spreading CSAM. And so I think it's really important that we do remember that if there is reasonable suspicion, then absolutely we can get a court order. We do that child's right and the due procedure rights and all of those other rights would dictate that you can investigate known or suspected child abuse material. But that doesn't entail then that it's proportionate for every single person in a democratic society to have their private communications scanned, because that is a gross infringement on all of our legitimate expectation to privacy. So it's not about whether people who spread abuse material have a right to privacy. We're talking about the whole scale invasion of everyone's devices. And I don't profess to speak on behalf of survivors, but at all, there's no but there again. Like Denton, I want to be very clear. I'll say separately that we do have children's groups that flag how important things like legitimate sexual self-determination and expression are for teenagers, for example. And so under some of these plans that we see, there's a risk that if you have the automated flagging of content shared by teenagers, so I'm not talking about the known content, I'm talking about unknown content, what you could actually find is this bizarre paradoxical situation where this legitimate self-expression of teenagers is being flagged to service providers for human review. And actually, that's not something that anyone wants. That's not good for young people. That's not good for those service providers. So I think it's, it's really important that we make these distinctions and do recognize the huge risks of scanning everyone's private communications.
Okay, thanks, Ella. Catherine, would you like to come in on this particular debate, or can I go down to the next question?
No, yeah, absolutely. And here I would like to basically share some of the recommendations at the I believe it's the Lanzarote Committee Council of Europe recent report on automated technologies for scanning of CSAM, generally speaking, child sexual exploitation material. And what strikes me there, they did a very deep analysis on all sorts of regulations, including the ePrivacy Directive, but also the case law of the European Court of Justice. And they acknowledged that the Court of Justice recognized this weight of the prohibition of child sexual abuse within the EU legal order, noting the gravity of the crime on the one hand as a particularly serious threat to fundamental interests of society, but also constituting a serious threat to public security and displaying particular serious characteristics. In the views of the court, I learned child sexual abuse is a grave violation of fundamental rights of the children. And so therefore it has embedded the protection against the online sexual exploitation in the principle of the best interest of the child. So that's also something to take into account. This was taken into account also by, of course, the UN, the EU Charter, the CSA Directive, and obviously the UNCRC that has been mentioned also by one of the panelists. But all in all, we have seen also, on the other hand, analyzing this report, very interesting, I believe September 2021 report, that apparently the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights are aligned in the sense that basically there should not be, states should not adopt, has not yet required states to adopt mandatory systems of reporting, for instance, by private parties. So in a way, acknowledging these tensions again between safety and privacy. So that's, if you look at from this interesting angle of what the jurisprudence is stating at this moment, at this very moment after the ePrivacy directive, it has a very interesting narrative also to understand and to interpret.
Okay. Thank you. Just to move down the questions, because we've got a few questions, which is great, but I wanted to answer them. We've got a question from Jürgen Bench, who's a director of public from Interactive Software Federation of Europe, and he's asking why this derogation is limited to child sexual abuse material, and does it not cover also other types of illegal content or conduct that can harm children? Now, I can confirm that the derogation is strictly limited to the detection of online child sexual abuse material as defined, which is child pornography and pornographic performance as defined by another directive. So it's extremely limited, and it doesn't cover other conducts that could be harmful to children. And I mean, I'm not, of course, working for the Commission, but I know what the Commission would say here. It would say it was a temporary derogation to fundamental rights protection, and therefore it had to be limited in scope. And so it is extremely limited. Maybe it's not needed, as Ella explained, but it is extremely limited. And then linked to that, unless somebody wants to come in, Denton, I suppose, have you got any calls to broaden the scope of this in any way to other types of conduct, or is it sufficient in your view?
Oh, I forgot to unmute. So the classic one online these days. So in regard to the derogation, I kind of have a very blinkered view requirement. In other words, I am focused on the CSAM issue, and it sort of it covers that issue in terms of. But if I take off my blinkers and I look at a wider circumstance, I'm sure there are much wider because in relative terms, CSAM is quite easy because it's very clearly defined what it is. You know, there's you don't need to be, believe me, once you see it, you know it, just put it that way. Whereas the other side of things become more subjective. And I'm just thinking in terms of, again, just to draw back to the points Ella issued or talked about in regard to communications between minors and of an explorative nature. That's when we get into the subjective things. So as a parent, you probably jump up and down and say, I'm not going to that's ridiculous, you can't be doing that. But on a societal level, we all did things as teenagers that we shouldn't have done. Okay. And but at the same time, we don't want anybody to know about them, and they go away, thankfully.
Yes, of course. Well, I mean,
so it's the longest answer to no, really, I don't. Sorry for the long.
No, I think we probably all agree on the panel that it's fine as it is. I'm sure Ella agrees with that as well.
I mean, I think it's quite clear that I would say it's disproportionate or potentially disproportionate as it is. But no, I think Denton's absolutely right. When you start getting into the realm of subjectivity, it's very, very risky, and it's right that the scope is narrow because of the level of restriction on everybody's rights. And I think there's a really interesting example that one of the MEPs working on the file gave, which was that you could put cameras in every person's bedroom and domestic violence might go down. That doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And I think when we're thinking about those kind of mass surveillance proposals to scan for any content that could potentially harm children, that's exactly the sort of thing we're looking at.
Okay, we've got another question which is to do with the future Digital Services Act and the extent to which we think that that Digital Services Act could do something to safeguard children's online experience. But I suggest maybe we don't answer that because it's a little bit too wide for the panel discussion that I would like to have here. I've got a lot more questions to ask. One thing that I found, there was, Ella was saying, okay, we don't have any real figures about the extent to which this scanning of our private communications has actually led, to communication of child sexual abuse to law enforcement authorities and to networks such as InHope. Maybe it would be interesting if Denton could say, because you were also saying at the beginning that the effect was not enormous at the moment. The regulation didn't have an enormous effect, if I understood it correctly. But there again, we had to have it, otherwise, it wasn't going to happen anymore. But do you have any figures to share about that, Denton, about the extent to which child sexual abuse material has been identified and communicated and acted upon by InHope and by law enforcement authorities?
Oh, okay. Now, this is I'm one of the reasons I made the distinction earlier on. Hotlines deal with the reported content from the public, so that's one strand. Okay, think of it as a triangle. Okay, so the reporting aspect is one side of it. Another side of it is the automated detection side of things. Okay, again, it's all about getting content off the digital landscape. Now, when we talk about automated detection, the thing is, the way automated detection, the current technologies that are in place, and Catherine mentioned the technology for the DNA is one of them, and Microsoft kind of led the way in that one. But what we also have is a situation that when, and I'm going to use a case in point if that's okay. I know, for example, that Meta, or what we used to call Facebook, but is now Meta, have been able to reinitiate their automated detection activity because they now have the protections under the derogation. But in 2020, because Meta, again, I have a problem calling it Meta Facebook because I've been calling it Facebook for so long. Because it's a US-based company, when they would automatically detect any known CSAM against the hash list, so in other words, it is now there's a very, very low case of false positives, but it's infinitesimal really. But when they're positives, they are automatically mandated to report to NCMEC. Okay, that's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the United States. Now, in 2020, they had 20 million reports. Okay. Now, it's 20 million and some, we'll just talk in large numbers for the purposes of this. When the derogation, basically, in the absence of the derogation, and Meta switched off, and they had to, okay, switch off the automated detection, the rate of reports per month fell off a cliff, okay, from Europe, not from the US, because they kept it going in the United States. It fell off a cliff. So all of that communications activity basically disappeared off the radar. Now, I don't have a number for that one, but just to be aware that it had a rapid effect. Now it's coming back as soon as it comes back up, because the people are still sharing content and they still get caught. And there's that information. Now, to take your question to the next level, which was about prosecutions. Now, when they get all those reports, they have to, one, confirm that it was illegal. And secondly, then they have to geographically or geolocate where those users are. And then they redistribute those reports through various sets of processes. When it's within Europe, the main clearinghouse is Europol. So they will then share all of the reports with Europol. And they in turn then break that down by country and distribute it throughout Europe. But there is also another feed, which is a project called Aviator. Now, I have to declare a complete bias here because InHope is a partner in Aviator. Okay, so openness and transparency.
Thanks for your transparency.
Yeah. So the thing is, the reports go into a triage system, which are then they're checked for false positives. They're also checked for correct tracing location, and then those reports do get disseminated to the correct authorities. The volumes are huge, and they're growing. Okay, I won't have numbers totally until the 31st of December, but I can only talk figuratively. There's a lot of traffic out there. It has a big impact. When it was switched off, it went down to a trickle. Okay. And there's another point, and I think it's very important in this context. Many of the providers obviously within other, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm open to correction on this, is that there were a lot of companies came to me because they were afraid of offshoring data outside the EU because they wanted to report to somebody, but they were afraid to report it offshore to non-EU countries. And they came to us looking for a solution to get around, well, not to get around, but basically so that they could be compliant, because they wanted to do the right thing. So in future legislation, we have to have solutions that can allow people, and I say this simply, to do the right thing. Okay, because I have yet to, within Europe, I have yet to meet a service provider, a technology company, anybody who says, I want content hosted on my services. It's the opposite. They want it off. It's nuclear waste. They want it gone. Okay, I'll stop talking now because I'm going on.
Yeah, thank you. So listen, what I suggest we do, because we've got a few minutes left, is that we turn to the future, okay? And we all know the Commission is preparing something slightly similar to what we've got for the number of independent interpersonal communication services that are going to apply to all online services. I haven't seen a text, so I've got no idea. Maybe taking some of the elements in the regulation that we've got here and applying it to other types of services. So maybe Catherine, if you go first, you were talking to probably you want legal certainty. If taking the regulation as it is, would you be quite happy for it to be extended across to all services, or not, sort of thing? What would you like, Catherine? The floor is yours, and then
right. Thank you for that question. And I think can you hear me? Yeah. I think we are in the process of understanding where the Commission is going to be landing with this CSAM long-term regulation, and of course we will strongly support the Commission's upcoming proposal. I believe it's a bit delayed for several reasons unknown to us, but all in all, we want to make this very clear. At the same time, we will also seek for clarity in the scope. And I think when you speak about legal certainty, this is the clarity in the scope and definition that is connected to that legal certainty. And I think we believe that that will be critical to achieve its goal in a manner that is both effective and proportionate, and so therefore future-proof. A couple of things about some, main expectations, and also where we align in this upcoming CSAM long-term regulation. One of them being, as I already explained, the inclusion of this safety by design. Once again, I want to stress here and reiterate that we believe that providers of digital services have the responsibility to design and operate their services in a way that help to protect and empower users to operate safety online. So this regulation should definitely facilitate this prevention and encourage innovation. On the second layer, we once again want to stress the need for clarity in the scope, and especially in regards now to what I would like to stress: intermediary categories, intermediary services categories covered under this upcoming regulation. So we propose to provide a clear intermediary categories and obligations covered under this regulation, taking into account the different risk profiles that face the services, different services. And finally, of course, we have also here strong voice around the creation of an EU centre, and on that point, we highlight our support to strengthen all in all European capacities. We think the development of a new centre to prevent and combat child sexual abuse will also provide an important focal point for Europe and support for instance, member states in this fight. We see a real potential for this center to help coordinate, for instance, a robust EU response to the threat and supporting the diverse range of member states, including, for instance, through research and information exchange. At the same time, we strongly encourage regulators to ensure this proposal supplements and supports existing ecosystems. For instance, the European Hotlines, the Europol work, rather than risking creating, duplicating, and existing mechanisms. That's where we stand at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Catherine, did I understand correctly that you're proning a sort of risk-based approach according to the type of intermediary, like in the
Right,
DSA?
and that's in relation to also what we're already familiar to, which is the DSA. The DSA has provided this risk framework in a way that it can be all in all understandable. Of course, there has been a lot of different amendments done to how the interpretation of that framework will unfold. But all in all, I think we believe that that's going to be a good way to to be able to portray with the risk that each services is presenting.
Denton.
Okay. Well, again, I'm going to come at this more so from a practitioner rather than a legal perspective. So I echo exactly what Catherine has said, and she's covered the hotlines and the non-duplication issue, which is we want to make sure that, like, we're very good at doing certain things. Europol are fantastic at doing other things. We complement each other. It would put things on a very more structured footing with the development of an EU centre. And we really look forward to that coming down the tracks. So there's a couple of small things. Well, they're big things for us, but there might be small things in the legislative framework. First and foremost is that within the EU legislation, that there is a formal legal recognition of hotlines and other trusted flaggers, so that they become hardwired or mentioned in legislation. Because when that regulation or whatever way it's developed percolates down onto a national level, that these organizations, and I'm using hotlines in point, are recognized. So it's not like they are just like an organization setting up a shop and trying to deal with child abuse material. The second point is more, it sort of sits in the bigger issue, which is depending on who you ask, a CSAM hash in theory could be recognized as a personal data, an item of personal data, because it falls under the heading of pseudo-anonymization. We would like to see some form of protection of known CSAM hashes to be protected from any being defined as personal data, and thus can be used and shared freely to remove that content without abusing anybody's privacy rights. Another one is a pan-European definition of what is actually illegal. There is a huge diversity across the member states of levels of illegality. In terms of should we say, the very heavy child sex abuse material, it's very clear. I mean, that's okay. But we're talking about a lot of posing or sexualized images of children, which are not illegal in in a number of member states. So a little bit of clarity that across the member states there's a uniform definition. And I think one point which I think is I know this is going to be part of it, but the rights of victims must be protected, and to establish their rights, and also to give them a form of way of, if you like, if an individual's abuse imagery has not been removed by a provider, that the individual would have recourse back to a provider for not removing that content if it had been advised by an authorized body. That is an aspiration I think many of us would hold, I think more from a societal perspective. And the last point I would make is there needs to be clear protections for technology companies who want to do the right thing. And again, I think Catherine articulated that very well. They need to know what they're able to do, what they're allowed to do, and they're not going to be attacked for it. And then on the flip side of that, there needs to be consequences, be them financial, sanction, or criminal, for technology companies that do not take active steps to combat child sex abuse material. Those are my points and observations.
Thank you very much, Denton. And you're saying they're not legal, but they are. You've got very many legal implications into what you said. I mean, even if you've gone, can you not hear me? You can hear me now. So yeah, I was just saying thanks, Denton. That was brilliant. I mean, even if you're saying it, you're coming from it from a very practical point of view, you've got a lot of legal implications in what you said. What I find interesting as well is the legal recognition of hotlines. That's something also that is happening, isn't it, through this new regulation that we're talking about today? Because I think that when we had the prep call last week with the Commission representative, she was saying that normally there was going to be the list of organisations was going to be published in the official journal. So I suppose In Hope will be on that list. So it's maybe a beginning of a legal recognition in Europe of hotlines. Maybe now we turn to Ella. I've got a feeling I know what you're going to say, but you're going to say it very well. So please go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry to be predictable, but I'm sure I will be. So yeah, there are some super worrying things that we've heard could be coming up in the long-term proposal. For example, one of the things that the Commission, DG Home, has floated is that obligations to scan content could be mandatory. So service providers could be forced to conduct mass surveillance against all of our communications. Also, we'd be very worried if the obligations weren't targeted, and we fear that there might be, given what's in the current temporary derogation, that there would be untargeted obligations. And again, that's forcing providers to scan everyone's private communications, not just people or networks against whom there is reasonable suspicion, which is a key part of due process. We're also very worried that it would be not just known content, but also unknown content. I know DG Home have said that they might want to include unknown content in scope, which is much more invasive as well as more unreliable. And I think that might be, at least my understanding from what Denton was saying as well, is that he would share some of the skepticism around that kind of discretionary unknown content issue. That might be one of the points on which we have some common ground. Then we're worried that there could be attacks on encryption in the long-term proposal, which is an essential pillar of so many parts of society: healthcare, banking, shopping. But we're seeing these concerted attacks against encryption across several legislative discussions, policy discussions, and we would warn that encryption should absolutely not be part of the scope. And we're also worried that, given that we already don't have transparency about who is doing the scanning, what technology they're using, what safeguards are in place, even for the temporary derogation, we'd be worried that there wouldn't be enough to do with transparency in the long-term one. To my point earlier, this seems very premature to be having the long-term regulation in the absence of so many of these really fundamental things like transparency, like proportionality. And I've mentioned proportionality and not a lot, and I think it's really the crux of what we're talking about. And I'm really interested to hear that InHope will have some figures at the end of the year, because in the European Commission's own impact assessment, when they put forward the derogation, some of the figures they give about the scale of CSAM sharing just had a footnote linking to a New York Times article. There's a real lack of the kind of robust evidence for us as civil society to be able to scrutinize. So, hotlines can definitely play a role, and we can see that some of the less harmful options could be things like the targeted intervention into suspected content, going through courts, having the judicial authorization, and making sure we have these processes in place that are really important in a democratic society, and not these automated upload filters. They're not the generalized scanning. And my last two recommendations then as well would be to have things like open source software. To reiterate my call from earlier, it should be the most privacy preserving, not proprietary software that we can't audit. And those leading should be EU agencies, not private US-based entities. So there's a lot that would need to change. And given that the derogation expires at the end of next year, we would really urge the EU institutions to make sure that there's not, once again, a democratic deficit in pushing through a really serious piece of legislation that can have a grave consequence on our rights and freedoms without the proper scrutiny.
Denton, the floor. I see you've got a remark to make.
Yeah, just one point, kind of to add to what Ella just said, but maybe coming at it from a slightly different angle, is that, again, I've started my sentence so often by saying I'm not a lawyer, okay? But my concern is that we've seen with the privacy directive that was written over many years, took many years to get it agreed, and then to full implementation takes many years. And then the language in that was of language of 2010, okay, and technologies of 2010. So whatever new legislation comes down the track, I don't know how to do this, but it needs to be future-proofed as much as possible to allow for the evolution. Like, we use terminology in terms of technology today that wasn't even invented 3 years ago. Okay, so we need to have a legislative process that factors that, what would you say, so that the terminology gets used doesn't date very quickly. That's really my point.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Ella, do you have any? Well, Catherine or Ella, do you have any comments to make?
Indeed, and thank you for offering again that chance, because I would like to reflect on one point. I think one of you mentioned on the obligation of non-monitoring. So we also wonder, you know, in the main spectrum of things of this upcoming long-term regulation, whether this regulation will fit within the wider framework of the DSA, which includes, as we know, the obligation of non-monitoring. And so that's a very critical question at this moment as well. At the same time, connected to the DSA, I think there's a lot of connections with the DSA in this sense, but also in the terms of timelines for content removal. So will these timelines go in the same standard subscribed by the DSA, or will there be different ones? And that's also a critical question that we want to add around the table.
Yeah, I think that's very critical. And I mean, it's true, when you go through the regulation, you see a number of things that are also echoed in the DSA, you know, in terms of internal complaint procedures, in terms of reporting obligations, in terms of oversight. You know, you've got different authorities. So it is a very, very complex legal situation that we're getting ourselves into, but an interesting one as well. And as you say, well, Ella and everybody, you know, it's going to be exciting debates again in the co-decision procedure in the European Parliament, Council, and European Commission. So that will be food for thought, certainly for 2022. I know that the new regulation was supposed to be proposed at the end of this year, but in the prep call we had with the Commission, they said it had been delayed because also this regulation had been delayed in its adoption and implementation. So, I mean, maybe they're waiting for more practical insights before they're proposing something new. So, I think we've coming to the end of this extremely interesting panel, and I'd like to thank the three of you for your very clear, honest, and thorough presentations. I think we've really got to the heart of the different problems, and maybe because the Commission wasn't there, you all managed to speak, you know, your mind very happily. So it was a great pleasure for me to chair this session with you, and thank you very much. Thanks to the audience, and it's the end of the conference, I think, but we've got some more. Stay here because there's some more things that are going to be said. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you, Michelle. Nice to see you again as well after such a long time.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
I had a quick look, actually. I think it was 2009 was the first event that you moderated.
That was the first conference. It was the first Forum Europe conference, you know.
It was. But yes, thank you again for your moderation. And yeah, I mean, it was obviously an important and at times somber discussion, so it was handled brilliantly. So thank you very much. And indeed, thank you to all the speakers from this session and from across the entire day for your input and participation. So that concludes this year's conference, as Michelle said, which I hope you enjoyed. It's a lot to pack in during one day, particularly online. So, of course, full replays will be available very shortly, as will a final wrap-up video in due course. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us again this year, for all your interaction across the day. I think we had a final viewership of just under 500. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us. I'd also like to express our gratitude again to Baker McKenzie, to BSA, the Software Alliance, to Google, Meta, Microsoft, OneTrust, SAP, and Workday for their support of this year's conference. To my colleague Annalise, who is really responsible for this event and someone who most of you will probably be in touch with at some point, and to my other colleagues, Rebecca Matheson, who's worked very closely on this project, Jerry Evans, and also Luke Pearson, thank you all for your work in bringing this year's event together as well. Very much appreciated, as always. So full details of all our activities are available online at forum-europe.com. And with that, I will close this year's conference. And if we're not in touch beforehand, wish you a safe and relaxing festive period. So thank you very much once again.